It's great to have back on the program today Bobby Azarian, who is a cognitive neuroscientist, blogger for Psychology Today, and also writer of the Substack Road to Omega. Bobby, it's great to have you back on today.
Thanks for having me, David. Appreciate it.
So maybe to start with, many of us have been seeing, we can go back and talk about during the pandemic. We can talk about January 6th in many different ways and from different people. We've been seeing behavior that seems dysregulated at minimum and other words that we could apply to it at worst if we want to. Can you talk first from a neuroscience standpoint? What is it that is happening when the way I would as a layman say it, their common sense seems to be almost hijacked in a sense, and they behave in ways that many of us find hard to imagine ever behaving ourselves? What is it that's taking place?
So I guess the first thing I'd say is that if we don't look at what's going on through the lens of science, in particular psychology, and more specifically a theory called terror management theory, we're going to be completely lost about what's going on. Things will just seem completely random and chaotic and unpredictable.
Yeah,
In a sense, they are certainly chaotic, but they're not totally unpredictable. So if we're looking at things from the perspective of psychology, and we look at all of the events that have transpired since really the emergence of Trump, really you can go back farther than that, then we see that a lot of these responses were due to events that cause existential fear in people. So, for example, Trump, the emergence of Trump himself was a response to fears over ISIS and fears over immigration. When Trump took power, then for people on the left, their fear was having an incompetent leader that stokes division. Then the pandemic hit, and there's like it's the biggest form of existential fear. We're all freaked out. So
sure.
when you have those conditions, basically that fear creates certain psychological effects that promote tribalism, that make us more aggressive towards people who don't share our worldview. And once that process happens, it's very hard to reverse that because there are certain psychological phenomena, like something I can talk about in a minute called amygdala hijack, where basically we're controlled by our fears. We're sort of programmed rather than being these rational thinkers. And once this happens, one side becoming more extreme polarizes the other side that's trying to balance that. And then you get on this trajectory where you're going towards just more divisive state. And so if you don't do something to get a hold of that, basically we're headed towards disaster.
So let's think a little bit like, for example, when I hear you say that a lot of this can be triggered when we're around people that don't share our worldview, and it creates this loop and cycle. With something like the anti-vaccine, anti-mask protests, I'm not seeing the pro-vaccine and pro-mask people behave the same way as the anti, although in some general sense, maybe it would happen because both are being challenged in terms of their worldview. The anti-mask people are being challenged by the pro and the pro by the anti, but we're seeing the erratic behavior almost exclusively from the anti-vaccine and anti-mask people. So what's causing that difference, that split?
Yeah, so I guess I would say that, okay, when you're talking about a very specific topic um, relating to the mask, then you do see that behavior on the right that doesn't make sense to us as progressives, but it can do things that so the left will be more like gung ho about wearing masks and like taking precautions. So
I
it's
see.
not that extreme behavior is always bad. Extremism is bad when the ideas are extremely stupid. So you can have radical good ideas that can transform society. And when you have a situation where there's this looming existential threat like the pandemic, it can catalyze civil rights movements, or it can catalyze civil wars. And really, when the threat is so extreme, it kind of does both those things at the same time. So, um, going back to what you said, I would argue that it's not fully on the right, and in the left, it manifests itself in different ways.
I
So,
see.
for example, yeah. So, for example, um, you have the Black Lives Matter movement, and that really exploded after the George Floyd murder, and that was in May, just right at the beginning of the pandemic, when in the U.S. we started seeing these like warnings to like wear a mask, not go outside, and stuff like that, and that explosion, that protest, like nationwide protest, occurred because everyone was so fearful because of the pandemic. And then you had this like counter movement. You had people like saying Blue Lives Matter in response to Black Lives Matter, and you know that was problematic. Didn't even make sense because the whole point of Black Lives Matter was saying Black lives should matter as much as everyone else's lives. So it was really all lives matter from the beginning. It's very ironic that like the other side started saying all lives matter when like that was what the first movement was about. Anyway, you get this defund the police movement in response to like this right wing Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter thing. And like that slogan like is very extreme. And now I see political campaign ads using that slogan to scare people away from Democrats. So I would say that the left matches the right. They just do it in completely different ways.
Right. And that's interesting. You bring up the defund now being used against some on the left. From the beginning, I said, I don't think this is a productive slogan, and here's why. And it's very interesting that you point to that. I do want to you mentioned the amygdala hijack. Can you talk about what that is so we're all on the same page with it?
Yeah, so basically, when we go through life, we're kind of mostly on autopilot, and some studies have showed that the famous Libet studies on free will. Basically, um, we're programmed, and we have a certain set of beliefs and goals, and we kind of behave according to those. But a lot of times, our programmed behavior won't be optimal. So if we're fearful, we might get aggressive. When that happens, there's another part of the brain um, that is responsible for kicking in and producing rational behavior, where we analyze the situation and then we make decisions where we're like more in control than being controlled by our instincts and reflexes. So the two brain areas that are important are the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala is involved in processing threat and is associated with the fear response. So when we do perceive a threat, basically it triggers the amygdala, and then that puts us in sort of like a fight or flight mode. Um, and then the prefrontal cortex, which is a newer part of the brain evolutionarily, and that part is supposed to calm the amygdala. And the problem is, in times where fear is super high, the prefrontal cortex can't do its job because the amygdala is just constantly being triggered. There's also some interesting studies that show correlations between impaired prefrontal cortex function, which is responsible for this. We call it cognitive control or executive control,
Right.
regulating your emotions, and so we see impaired executive control with people who are religious fundamentalists, or we see it with people who score high on surveys of racism. We see it in people with drug addiction. So basically, those people are less in control. You could say they have less free will because they're unable to override this programming and this effect that you have when basically the amygdala hijacks the cognitive system. So, what we can do about that is become aware of that. And simply becoming aware, having what's called meta awareness, can give you control over that. And then there are exercises you can do, like practicing mindfulness, to kind of strengthen the prefrontal cortex because it really is like a muscle.
thinking of that, I ask this not to excuse morally, ethically, or legally the actions of the January 6th rioters, but I ask it in order to try to understand, is it a type of situation where you're in this mass of people and someone decides to start busting down doors or breaking windows and going in? Is it possible that you sort of experience an amygdala hijack there and you just kind of are riding high and carried in and participating, not because you went intending to do that, but because the situation around you sort of puts you into that state? Is that a situation where this happens?
Definitely. And I would like to say that it's really important to understand these people, because if we don't understand the mindset, we'll have we'll be completely lost.
Yeah.
In terms of how to get through to them. So when you talk about empathy for these people, it's not so much about like wanting to be a better human being to have empathy for them. It's really more about being practical, finding a solution to the problem. So these people, just like you said, during like the Capitol attack, um, they're tuned into social media. They're plugged into the people who are stoking that fear constantly. They're responding to the others around them and things that are happening in real time. And so you kind of get this collective effect where it's like the amygdala hijack is kind of like spreading from person to person. And once that happens, if there's not someone that comes out and says, "Hey, everybody, like this is kind of crazy,"
Right.
it's just going to snowball.
Is mob mentality kind of a layman's term for group amygdala hijack?
Yes, definitely.
Hmm.
It's related to that. It's also related to tribalism. Um, I didn't go into terror management theory. I know we talked about it last time. I could talk about that a little bit in relation to like this mob mentality, if you want.
Yeah, I would be interested in hearing that because I mean, what we're, many of us are starting to say, is this going to happen again? How likely are these folks who in some online spaces are saying, if we don't get X, it's going to be time for January 6th part 2 or whatever. I think it would be important to understand what it is that could get them there, but also what could prevent it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to prevent it, I think to get a understanding of what's actually going on, we have to understand terror management theory. So terror management theory starts with the fear of death. So at some point in the evolutionary development of man, or human, I should say, we became intelligent enough to be aware of our own mortality,
Right.
that someday we're going to inevitably die and be gone and possibly forgotten. And that realization can be paralyzing if you don't have a psychological mechanism for coping with that. So when that happened, that necessitated the invention of cultural worldviews like religions, political ideologies, national identities. Cultural worldviews basically act as death anxiety buffers by giving us a sense of purpose and meaning in life. Um, Actually, they are said to offer paths to immortality. So a religion, uh, excuse me, David. Religion offers a path to literal immortality through the concept of an afterlife, and national identities offer a path to what's called symbolic immortality through feeling like you're part of this bigger movement, this bigger idea that will outlive the individual. So, what terror management theory says is that if cultural worldviews are how we deal with existential fear, then in times when there's some existential threat looming, or we're reminded of our death for some other reason, we are going to cling to our cultural worldviews more. We're going to become more tribal, and we're going to become more aggressive towards people who have different worldviews. So really, it explains tribalism. It's interesting because worldviews basically, you needed some sort of worldview to emerge to have human civilization, because it's what binds people together under a common idea. But at the same time, if you have people at different parts of the world, uh, different cultural worldviews are going to emerge. So the thing that unites people within the group is the very same thing that divides people into tribes. So one of the ways to deal with this is to look at your different worldviews, look at what you have in common. Like, for example, look at the things that the right are complaining about and they're fearful about that are valid. Now, there are going to be a lot of things that aren't valid, a lot of crazy things that just have nothing to do with reality, but there are going to be some things that are legitimate concerns, things that they care about. Um, and we try to align interest at that point. And if we can do that, we can start to create some sort of unifying worldview. And we really need to do that consciously. It doesn't happen by accident. So there will be a second capital attack, something not necessarily at the Capitol, but something that's like that.
Right.
Uh, we're headed there. And if we don't do something very consciously to change that trajectory, I would predict that it will happen for sure.
So would I. So would I. We've been speaking with Bobby Azarian, who's a cognitive neuroscientist, blogger for Psychology Today, and also writes the Substack Road to Omega. Bobby, it's always great having you on. I appreciate it.
Great, David. Can I mention the Road to Omega project? So
Yes.
that's really what me and some colleagues and friends and allies have started to design, which just sets out a solution for all of this. So everything we talked about, problem of tribalism, understanding that, a Bayesian reasoning system, a logical reasoning system to fight misinformation and conspiracy theories. And that plan is up at roadtoomega.substack.com.